Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program John Ganz, writer of the Unpopular Front newsletter on SubStack and author of When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. Welcome to the program, John.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with, let's start with the broken clock.
Sure.
Quote, and in many respects, it explains why this, more or less half a decade that you've written about in the early 1990s.
Yeah, so I got this metaphor, this image from a speech by a libertarian economist named Murray Rothbard, and he gave this at the John Randolph Club, which was kind of a paleo-conservative, paleo-libertarian convention, and he gave it this speech in honor of Pat Buchanan, who was trying to primary George H.W. Bush at the time. And he said to uproarious applause in the crowd, "We're going to break the clock of social democracy. We're going to break the clock of the New Deal. We're going to repeal the 20th century." And I just thought this was a wonderful image for a few reasons. One of which being that, as I was doing research for this book, I just kept getting this uncanny feeling that we were sort of stuck in the era that was being written about. So it kind of felt like When the Clock Broke. And it was also a little bit of a play on Francis Fukuyama's End of History. The ideas that we were now done with the age of ideological struggles, and liberal democracy was going to be the only game in town. So instead of the triumph sort of the end of history, I have a little different spin on it, which is a time when the clock broke, the clock of progress.
I still don't get that metaphor that he used, though, because a clock goes round and around.
Well, I think he was referring to his communist youth. Not his communist youth. He grew up in the Bronx. He was a child of Jewish Russian immigrants, and many of his family members and neighbors were Communist Party members. And he used to be told, "You can't turn back the clock. You can't turn back the clock. Socialism is the way of the future." And he said, "Well, the clock of the Soviet Union now lays broken on the ground." So yes, it's true. It does go around and around, but I guess it does mark that time is going forward too.
I guess so. All right. Okay. So the early 90s you see as what happening? What did this sort of, what was unique about this era, or what does it mark in terms of the trajectory of, we call it conservatism, or the right-wing universe, I guess?
Well, I think this is when conservatism, in a way, begins to end and something else starts to appear. The conservative movement's energies have sort of run out, and a more radical right emerges on the scene. So I think there's a broader political, economic, and social crisis in the United States that was brought about by a lot of changes in the economy, largely due to Reaganomics and what we now call very often neoliberalism. And instead of that naturally kind of leading to interest in returning to a more egalitarian society, to the ideas of FDR and the New Deal, it was the occasion for the launching of a revolution on the right, a more muscular right-wing push that was not only opposed to, say, the welfare state or regulating the economy. Or was in favor of free trade. It actually was more of an attack on egalitarian society in general, on political equality, and even on democracy itself.
So I think, for a while we called this movement conservatism, where it was like, just sort of not really as much ideologically based as it was sort of in and out group type of based. But I want to return to that
Sure.
conversation and track it, because you start with David Duke, who folks may not remember, but was at one point like the Grand Wizard of the KKK. And then all of a sudden he was just a Republican candidate.
Yes, he was, I think in the 70s and 80s, he was the face of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. And then he quite literally got a facelift and started to run for offices as a Republican. He won one of those offices. It was for a state legislator seat in Louisiana, in Metairie, which is just outside of New Orleans. It's kind of a white flight suburb, or it was at the time. Then he ran for United States Senator. He lost, but he won almost 60% of the white vote. And then in the next year, he ran for governor of Louisiana, and he won 55% of the white vote. And this is with public's full knowledge, but perhaps disavowal, that he had not only been a member of the Ku Klux Klan, but a self-avowed neo-Nazi. And the political establishment was obviously very spooked by this. The Republican Party, both on the local level and the national level, really struggled to get rid of David Duke. He was not their chosen candidate, but he continually won primaries. The president of the United States came out against him, both in the person of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. The RNC sent staff down to stop David Duke. They really struggled with it. And many people on the hard right of the Republican Party and the conservative movement were not spooked by the emergence of David Duke as a challenge to the Republican establishment. They viewed it as a very hopeful sign that their sort of politics had arrived. And it was a signal for Pat Buchanan to launch his primary campaign against George H.W. Bush.
Just give us a sense of because I'm not sure if people, how much people are aware of this, but George Herbert Walker Bush was brought on to basically be the establishment sort of like anchor for Ronald Reagan. I mean, not terribly dissimilar. If you take out the God Squad stuff about Mike Pence, because people forget that Mike Pence was also like a Koch brothers. He was into Congress. I mean, Mike Pence represented a lot of things, but I think for the Republican establishment, Mike Pence was their entree into that office. Sorry about that. I just hit my butt. Was their entree in there. And George Herbert Walker Bush was sort of the same thing for Ronald Reagan, right? I mean, but they considered him mealy. Like the right never particularly liked him that much.
They hated him or they distrusted him. I mean, George H.W. Bush ran both when he tried to win the Republican primary in 1980 and also when he was the running mate of Reagan. Tried to run as a faithful conservative. It was quite right wing on a lot of things. He had been always pro-choice from a kind of high WASP tradition of family planning. And he abandoned this in order to, be a part of the new Republican Party that was being shaped by Reagan and the new right. But he was never trusted by the real hard right of the conservative movement. They thought he was a Rockefeller Republican. They thought he was a liberal, a pragmatist, a centrist, did not have the ideological bona fides that they wanted. And they thought he stood in an almost populist way, or in a quite populist way. They thought he stood for the Eastern establishment. Which they thought that they were out to unseat in favor of middle Americans. So yes, George H.W. Bush was someone who went from fairly distrusted to out and out enemy of the right wing.
I mean, they were sort of right. I would add in all of his Saudi relationships and everything from the CIA. But and I think like Souter, appointing Souter. I mean, he really, in many respects, betrayed. I guess my point is like it sort of feels like there's a trajectory there, in that George Herbert Walker Bush was the anomaly in terms of that trajectory on some level.
Yes. He does in a way represent the old Republican Party. As a kind of stodgy party of the establishment, and he in many ways represents the old United States. I mean, he comes from a very ancient family. He has another president in the family. They go back to the start of the country, and his father his grandfather was a senator. he did really belong to an earlier time. And I think he found himself extremely disconcerted and confused by the direction the country was taking in the early 1990s. It didn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense to him. And the truths about politics and the American people that he thought he knew, and the common sense that he thought he knew, didn't really seem to obtain anymore. You see but we see echoes of it in Jeb. The whole camp, that please clap moment. There are many moments like that. When I was writing my book, I was really getting a kick out of it, where George H.W. Bush feels kind of entitled to adulation, and when he's not getting it, he's very frustrated and angry and dismayed. But yes, he was a pragmatist, quite reasonable. He was able to come to realize that the United States, couldn't just continually cut taxes and still survive. And he was punished for going back on his no new taxes pledge. That was considered also to be a big betrayal on the right. But I think perhaps what's missed is he made a compromise on something called the Civil Rights Act of 1991. He vetoed that and then signed something called the Civil Rights Act of 1992. This is a piece of legislation that only an employment lawyer might tell you about now. But at the time, it was feared by conservatives to be going to enter what they called quotas into employment. Basically, it permitted minorities and women to sue their employees. And they thought that this was going to create the pressure on employees to hire minorities and women and not hire white men. So in a very early version of a kind of anti-woke panic, there was a big storm about the civil rights, Bush signing this compromise version of the Civil Rights Act. That's the moment in which Buchanan decides that he has to primary Bush as the signing of the Civil Rights Act. So the no new taxes thing everybody knows, but I think fewer people know about the Civil Rights Act.
His and the thing is, his pledge for no new taxes was literally "read my lips." No new taxes is what he said, and I mean, you couldn't have made a bigger deal about there being no new taxes, and then him having to do that. I also will say this too. I remember there's one quote I remember when he was running against Dukakis. They brought his sister out to make him seem amenable to your average day people. And her quote was, and this is a paraphrase because it's literally 35 years ago. We had very strict parents. We grew up like a lot of kids. If we left our tennis rackets out in the rain, we got punished. And I just remember thinking, like, if Dukakis can lose to a guy like that, that's insane. But and then so let's talk about Buchanan, because I also remember this era. Bush definitely is aware that this is growing on his right flank. And I think Dan Quayle is brought in to be the sort of the ballast in some way to make up for what people feel that Herbert Walker Bush does not have. And he goes out there and attacks a fictional TV character, Murphy Brown, for having a child out of wedlock. And that in some lame attempt to sort of like forestall what Buchanan was doing.
Yes, I think this was the beginning of what we now call the culture wars, and the Murphy Brown incident, which is incidentally one of my earliest memories of American politics, because I think I was 7 years old.
Oh, geez.
I remember. Yeah. So what is important to remember about that is this happens in the wake of the Rodney King riots. Everyone is looking for the cause of the Rodney King riots, right? And what the Republicans want to say is that this is women having children out of wedlock is causing a cultural and social crisis of morality in the United States. Now, that usually has a very clear racial dimension, but in going after Murphy Brown, that can be directed against white liberal elites and doesn't have to be against poor black women. This creates a big nationwide furor, partially because it's so bizarre. And it becomes a huge national debate. Actually, in my opinion, distracting from the quite serious issues of the LA riots, which are, rampant police brutality and a Los Angeles that was basically an almost depression level of poverty at the time. That gets quickly forgotten. The news media fixates on the Murphy Brown story. It keeps on coming up. It becomes a big national debate over whether or not it was a good thing to show. It puts the Bush administration a little bit of a bind because on the one hand, Quayle kind of gets over his skis criticizing it, but they're also have to say that they're pro-life. So they also say, well, it's good that she's having the baby because we're pro-life. So Bush eventually gets frustrated being asked by questions by reporters about it. He kind of snaps at them. Ross Perot goes on, in a speech says it's goofy that it's being talked about. Who takes it more seriously actually is Bill Clinton. He speaks sensitively about the whole issue and takes seriously the family value issues that the Republicans are trying to raise, but deflects them in a less aggressive direction.
This era is so fascinating because there's all of that type of like, it's the equivalent of gosh, I can't remember now his name, who was George Herbert Walker Bush's campaign, Ailes. Not Ailes, but
Lee Atwater.
Lee Atwater. Whose whole sort of like famously had said, you used to use the N-word. Now you can just say busing. And then, say busing, then you say taxes. And of course, he came out of Nixon's sort of orbit, where Buchanan also came out of Nixon's orbit. And so there's this sort of like one part of the Republican Party still using coded stuff. Yes. And the other part of the Republican Party is going like, we don't need to do that anymore.
Right.
And also in the backdrop of this is Limbaugh, who at that point is talking about feminazis. And I remember George Herbert Walker Bush going on Limbaugh's show to like ingratiate himself with Limbaugh. And I think this is also around the time that like Limbaugh was so big by the early 90s that he was doing Monday Night Football. I don't know if this was a little bit afterwards, but I mean, this is what was going on at that time. It was very strange.
Well, I mean, George H.W. Bush says, talk shows are becoming increasingly powerful. He sort of resents this. He said, I'm the president of the United States. I'm not going to do these weird Geraldo type shows. Then he sees he looks at the polls, and he invites Rush Limbaugh to the White House, and he carries his bags to the Lincoln bedroom. One of the most shameful displays of a U.S. president ever. So yes, the power of talk radio is becoming very evident. Pat Buchanan realizes this. He's trying to court Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh's listenership is already very sympathetic to Pat, going over his direction. Rush Limbaugh, in his ideology, insofar as you can say he has one, is much more of a conventional Reagan Republican, really a republicanism of the rich. But his listenership is very interested in what Pat is saying, and Pat also does get his start in the Nixon administration. It's not many people might realize this, but Richard Nixon was not very much liked by the conservative movement. He was viewed at that time as a pragmatist, a bit of a liberal, a centrist, not enough of an ideologue. Buchanan, as a kind of protege of Buckley and coming out of that sphere, was an exception to that rule. He was very close personally with Nixon, and he had a interesting interpretation of what Richard Nixon's presidency meant. To him, Nixon was a kind of representative of what he called the silent majority. That's Buchanan's phrase. He wrote that, of Middle America, whose presence was resented and feared by the Eastern establishment elite, and who, in the form of Watergate, basically launched a coup against Richard Nixon. And the big failure of Richard Nixon, the missed opportunity of his presidency, was not launching some kind of counter coup, using the chaos of Watergate to launch some counter coup. So he has this very, I don't know how you would say it, authoritarian interpretation of Richard Nixon's presidency, which in certain ways he shared with Richard Nixon himself. Then he works for the Reagan administration, a little bit more ideologically sound, but still too pragmatic for Pat. And Pat says, I think to Sid Blumenthal in the late 80s in an interview, the biggest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. And his political trajectory from then on, as he's maneuvering to run for president, is to occupy that vacuum to the right of Ronald Reagan.
And we know that Pat Buchanan's politics, and particularly his rhetoric, was heavily borrowed from in the Trump 2016 campaign in particular. I'm struck by the rhetoric being nearly identical about the U.S.-Mexico border, really before it was embraced by the mainstream Republican Party. Can you give our audience a sense of some of those through lines and how much Trump borrowed from him?
I mean, Trump... They have almost identical messages in 2016. It's true. The difference is that Buchanan, although a bit of a thug, is an educated man. He quotes Yeats in his speeches. It's a little pretentious and highbrow. Trump has, let's say, a folksier style. But yes, in terms of the border, trade, U.S. foreign intervention, all of these things, all these critiques of the mainstream of the Republican Party that Trump comes in like a wrecking ball and really blows them away with, Buchanan is articulating, 23 years earlier. And this commonality, they both recognize it. Buchanan said in an interview not too long ago, Trump is the last stand for my ideas. Trump has cited Buchanan favorably in speeches on several occasions. Back in 1992, on Larry King, Trump kind of is asked about politics, and he notes the emergence of both David Duke and Pat Buchanan and says it reflects a tremendous anger in this country. And so he's both aware and quite interested in the potentials of their politics even back then.
Well, they both, Trump didn't officially run for the Reform Party ticket. I know that's a little farther down the line in 2000, but he did criticize Buchanan from the left at that point, which was that Buchanan was too racist and voters were rejecting that. And then, reportedly, he ended up apologizing to Buchanan ahead of the 2016 campain because he borrowed so.
Turns out I was wrong.
Turns out,
I mean, actually,
the first time he admitted he was wrong, maybe.
I actually did not know that, Emma, that he apologized to Pat Buchanan. That's fascinating. It's not. I mean, it's shocking that he apologized, but the substance of it isn't shocking because yes, he ran on a very similar message. That also, that attack that he tried to make on Buchanan from the left is remarkable because when he was confronted in 2016 about David Duke's endorsement of him, he pretended like he had no idea who David Duke was, but he explicitly cited David Duke in his attack on Buchanan. And also he absolutely knew who David Duke was because he said his name on Larry King back in 1992. He was paying attention to the news. So that dance he's done with that part of the political world is interesting. He's never been totally willing or able to disavow or eject it entirely because he knows it's an important part of his base. It's an important part of the constituency that's giving him majorities, not in the country, but definitely in Republican primaries.
Can we talk about like the strands that seem to meet there on the right? Because you've got you've got this sort of the old country club republicanism is still sort of viable at that era. And it's really, Reagan was contrary to that in many respects. And, Reagan had his own nod with his, announcement at near the
Neshoba County Fair.
The Neshoba County Fair to states' rights, which is where, of course, the civil rights guys from Illinois got killed. And so he was nodding to that. Bush was less comfortable with that type of stuff because he just didn't talk about that. You didn't even allude to it. But this is growing. You also have limbo. I mean, because I think talk radio is such a huge part of this. I think without talk radio, Donald Trump has nothing to say, frankly, and right-wing talk radio. Yeah. And it's also, you've got Buchanan, who's sort of like part of the legacy of the John Birch Society, right?
Yes.
But also Limbaugh, who's not as explicitly John Bircher, but in content, but in terms of modality, he is. I mean, because this is a guy who, like we still talk about this. Dana Loesch, even just like 5 years ago, said to like an FCC chair, like, I'm surprised you weren't Vince Fostered. And no one who's not a right winger would have any idea what that means. But because of Limbaugh, particularly, I think like it comes a couple of years later, but Limbaugh is ready for this. He basically promotes this idea that the Clintons killed one of their aides, Vince Foster, and dragged him into a park in DC. And so Limbaugh's like starting to flirt around that time with that type of like modality, almost like borrowed from Art Bell. And and those things integrate at one point, and it just sort of grows through the Clinton years.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, what Limbaugh, like Trump in many ways, he adopts the language, the music of the extreme right, but knows the tricks of entertainment and show business and makes it appealing. Limbaugh is a figure of mass culture. He is not a crank on the fringes. He has millions of listeners. He doesn't exactly replicate every single trope or idea that he gets from the extreme right, but certainly in terms of the malice, the anger, the willing to engage in conspiratorial speculations like about Vince Foster, he absolutely imports that. What he like Trump does is there's a lot of glee to it. He's an entertainer, and this is also something interesting to think about in terms of Reagan. I mean, Reagan is very different in some ways from the main or the core of the conservative movement, because the conservative movement very pessimistic and dour. Right. Reagan has a very sunny affect. Reagan is almost a synthesis of FDR and conservatism. So.
He's the happy warrior type of thing.
Exactly. Now, Limbaugh and Trump are not quite the same, but they do bring a level of enjoyment to this sorts of stuff, which is more accessible to a mass audience than, say, someone who was, really liked, someone of the real fringes, the radio programs or literature of the propaganda. So it's almost a adaptation of those themes for a broader audience. And Limbaugh and Trump are parallels in that way. And the kind of happy vulgarity, the enjoyment of, making nasty jokes about women and minorities that you got from talk radio. Trump definitely, his brain is almost, is made up of talk shows. I mean, that's the way he expresses himself. It's partly Howard Stern. It's partly Rush Limbaugh. It's partly TV. Basically, a good way to think about Trump is just someone who has done nothing but tune into those things and really not done much thought or else. So he kind of just, is a broadcasts it back and does it well.
I would say Mark Levin, it's probably, I get the sense, is one of his biggest, because Hannity is good friends with Levin. I mean, that whole world. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.